The lake house goes to your brother. Dad said at Christmas dinner, he's the son who deserves roots. Mom nodded like I wasn't there. I smiled, opened my phone under the table, then canceled the $620,000 renovation fund in my name. 10 minutes later, his phone started ringing. My name is Callum. I'm 37 years old, and I had financed $620,000 of my brother's inheritance before my father finished his sentence at the Christmas dinner table. He said it the way men say things they've already decided. Not as an announcement, not as a question. Just a statement, the way you'd say it's cold outside, or the roads are bad this time of year. The lake house goes to your brother. He's the son who deserves roots. My mother nodded and reached for the breadbasket. My brother Owen looked at his plate and tried not to smile. He wasn't quite fast enough. I sat at that table for another 10 minutes. I helped myself to the potatoes. I asked my niece how school was going. And somewhere underneath the tablecloth, away from anyone's line of sight, I opened my phone and found the renovation fund authorization I had personally set up 4 months earlier. I canceled it. Every dollar of it. Gone in 3 taps. Owen's phone started ringing 6 minutes later. It was the contractor. The one Owen had hired on the assumption that I was still paying. Nobody at that table understood what they had just heard. Not yet. I need to tell you who I was before that Christmas, because the story doesn't make sense without it. I'm a civil engineer, have been for 12 years. I work for a mid-sized structural firm in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and for the last 4 of those years I've been a project lead, which means I'm the person who looks at a building someone wants to put up and tells them whether the ground underneath it will hold. I don't work with feelings. I work with load-bearing calculations. I work with soil compaction reports and material stress tests and the kind of numbers that either add up or they don't. There is no version of my job where close enough is acceptable, because close enough in my field means a floor fails 3 years after construction and someone gets hurt. I bought my own house at 31, a 4-bedroom in Ypsilanti. I've been slowly renovating myself. I have a workshop in the garage where I do the work I can't bill for, the kind of work I do just because I want to understand how a thing fits together. I am not a wealthy man, but I am an organized one, and those are 2 different things that people confuse for each other all the time. My family's lake house sits on 8 acres of frontage on Lake Leelanau, north of Traverse City, Michigan. My grandfather built the main structure in 1971, and my father added the guest wing in 1994. It has been in our family for over 50 years. It is worth, depending on the season and the real estate market, somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million. It is the single largest asset my parents own. I have been maintaining it for 11 years. Not visiting it, maintaining it. There is a difference, and the difference is documented. My brother Owen is 34. He works, loosely speaking, in sales. He has worked, loosely speaking, in 4 different kinds of sales since graduating college. He is charming in the way that men are charming when they've learned that charm is a substitute for follow-through. He has a daughter named Maddie, who I genuinely love, and he has a wife named Sasha, who is more practical than he deserves. And he has a talent for arriving exactly when something is finished and making it look like he helped. The lake house to him was always going to be his. I didn't understand that until Christmas. No, that's not honest. I understood it the way you understand something you've decided not to look at directly. The signs were all there. I just kept paying instead of reading them. Let me give you the shape of 11 years in 4 specific moments, because I want to be precise. Moment 1. The summer I was 26, the dock had rotted through at 3 structural points. My father called me, not Owen, because I was the engineer. I flew up from Ann Arbor on a weekend I had already planned to use differently. I pulled the rotted sections, sourced the replacement lumber, and rebuilt 14 feet of dock with a friend I paid in pizza and 2 cases of beer. Total material cost, $2,800 time. 1 long weekend and 2 follow-up days. My father thanked me by name at the following Thanksgiving. Owen said the dock looked great. He had not been there. Moment 2, winter of the year I turned 29, the boiler in the main house failed during a cold snap that dropped Leelanau County to 14 below. My parents were in Florida. Owen was in Phoenix at a sales conference. I drove 4 hours north on roads that had no business being driven on. I got the emergency plumber on the phone, authorized the repair, wrote the check, and stayed 2 nights to make sure the pipes hadn't stressed beyond threshold. The repair came to $6,400. I submitted to my father as an expense. He said he'd pay me back when things loosened up a little. They never quite loosened up. I stopped submitting. Moment 3. The spring I was 32, my parents mentioned casually, over Easter dinner, that the guest wing foundation had developed a crack they'd been watching for 2 seasons. They mentioned it the way you mention a crack, not with urgency. Owen was there. He looked at me and said, "You know about this stuff, right, Cal?" My father said it would be great if I could take a look. I took a look. What I found was not a cosmetic crack. What I found was a section of the foundation wall that had shifted 11 millimeters off true over what I estimated was 3 to 4 years of water, infiltration through a failed perimeter drain. I wrote a full assessment on my own time. I sourced 2 contractors, vetted their bids, oversaw the repair, and signed off on the work. Total cost $34,000. My parents put $20,000 toward it. I covered the rest. Owen sent a text that said, "Thanks for handling that, bro." Moment 4. 4 months before Christmas, September. My father called me while I was eating lunch at my desk. He said the lake house needed work. Not a specific repair this time, a full renovation. The main bathroom, the kitchen, the deck off the back, new windows throughout the guest wing, updated electrical to bring it current with code. The kind of work that, when you add it up correctly, runs well past $500,000 on lakefront property. He said they wanted it done before Owen and Sasha considered using it more regularly. He used that phrase, using it more regularly. I registered it. I didn't ask what it meant. Then he asked if I could manage the fund. He explained that the renovation loan, secured against the property, needed a co-signer with documented income and strong credit because my parents' income was now fixed and their credit history had some softness from a refinance 2 years back. He needed my signature on the loan authorization. He needed the fund in my name so the draws could be processed cleanly. I asked who would be paying it back. He said the property would. When they sold it someday, the renovation costs would come out of proceeds first. I asked who the property was going to. He said we'd cross that bridge when we came to it. I should have pushed, I know that. In my professional life, I do not proceed on an undefined load-bearing assumption. But this was my father. And the lake house was part of my childhood in a way that made me softer than I had any business being. And so I signed. $620,000 authorization. My name, my credit, my signature on the dotted line, because that is what I do. I carry what needs carrying, and I tell myself it's what you do for family. 4 months later, I was at the Christmas table listening to my father explain where the property would go when they were gone. Owen had apparently already been told. The way his shoulders relaxed when my father said it told me he'd known for a while. The way my mother nodded and reached for the bread without looking at me told me she'd known longer. The way nobody in that room turned to gauge my reaction told me that in their version of this story, my reaction didn't factor. I was the bank. The bank does not have feelings about the will. My phone was in my lap under the tablecloth. The Renovation Fund authorization portal was saved in my bookmarks because I accessed it regularly as the managing signatory. I found it in 3 seconds. I navigated to the account controls. I sat and waited through one more bite of turkey. I watched Owen smile at something Sasha said. I watched my father pour himself a second glass of wine with the ease of a man who has finished a task he was glad to be done with. I watched my mother pass the rolls to my niece Maddie, who was 7 years old and wearing a paper crown from a Christmas cracker and completely innocent of everything in this room. I closed the fund. Not partially. Not paused, closed, the authorization canceled, the pending draws suspended, the contractor payment schedule voided, all of it, in the time it takes to pass the potatoes. I set my phone face up on my thigh. 6 minutes later, Owen's phone rang. He looked at the screen and a small crease appeared between his eyebrows. He excused himself to the hallway. I could hear one side of the conversation from where I sat. I continued eating. My father asked me how work was going. I told him it was good. A bridge project in Washtenaw County. Interesting soil conditions. He nodded the way he always nodded when I talked about my work, with the polite attention of a man waiting for the sentence to end. Owen came back to the table 2 minutes later. His face was a specific kind of careful that meant he was working to keep it neutral. He sat down and picked up his fork and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he looked at me across the table. I was looking at my plate. I want to pause here for a second, because some of you already know the shape of what's underneath this, and some of you are still catching up. If you've ever been the one who carries the weight while someone else gets the credit and then the inheritance, you know exactly what was sitting in my chest at that table. It wasn't anger. Anger would have been easier. It was something quieter and more total, the feeling of a load-bearing wall finally being shown the true weight it's been asked to carry. Stay with me, because what I found in the weeks after that dinner made the Christmas table look like the beginning of a much longer conversation. Hit subscribe so you're there when it ends. Owen sent a text at 9:47 that night. I was back in my own house in Ypsilanti, sitting in my workshop with a cup of coffee I wasn't really drinking. The text said, "What happened with the Hendricks contract?" Contractor said the fund was closed. I read it once. Then I set the phone on the workbench face down. I didn't respond that night. I had work to do. Not Owen's work. My own. I'm an engineer. Before I do anything irreversible, I document the existing conditions. That's a professional habit so embedded in me that I do it for my own life without deciding to. So that night, I opened a folder on my laptop that I had been keeping for 11 years without ever intending to use it as evidence. It was just my records. I am the kind of person who keeps receipts, not out of suspicion, but out of the same instinct that makes me write down every site visit, every material spec, every field measurement. It's just what I do. And so sitting there in my workshop at 10 o'clock on Christmas night, I had 11 years of bank records for every repair, replacement, and maintenance and expense I had ever paid on a property I did not own. I had the foundation assessment I had written on my own professional letterhead. I had the contractor bids I had vetted. I had the boiler invoice, the dock lumber invoices, the permit applications I had filed on my father's behalf because he didn't know how. I had a folder labeled Lake Leelanau House with 247 individual line items going back to when I was 26 years old. I added it up that night. I had done this before once, about 2 years in, and then put the number in a drawer and not looked at it again. This time, I let the number sit in front of me, $138,400. That was the total of what I had personally contributed to a property that was now, according to my father's announcement at Christmas dinner, going to my brother. Plus the $620,000 renovation fund I had just closed, which I was still legally obligated on until the cancellation process fully, a fact I had already confirmed with the lender's after-hours line. $758,000, plus 11 years. I sat with that number until the coffee was cold. Then I went to bed. Owen called 3 times the next day. I let it go to voicemail each time. His messages escalated with the predictable rhythm of a man who had assumed things were fixed and was discovering they weren't. First message, 9 in the morning, calm and businesslike. Could I call him back when I had a chance? Something came up with the contractor. Second message, noon, slightly less calm. The contractor was asking about the payment schedule, and there seemed to be some kind of problem with the account. Third message, 4 in the afternoon, the calm was gone. His voice had the tone of a man who has decided someone else is responsible for his problem. He said Hendricks, the contractor, was threatening to drop the project. He said this was a huge deal. He said he needed me to fix it. I called him back at 5. I told him the fund was closed. There was a pause that lasted longer than a breath. What do you mean closed? He said. The authorization is canceled, I told him. The account is closed. The pending draws are voided. Another pause. I could hear him breathing. Why? I told him I had decided that was the right decision for me. He said that didn't make any sense. He said the contractors were already scheduled. He said Hendricks had already ordered materials. He said this was a disaster. I told him I was sorry to hear that. He said, Cal, come on. You know what this renovation means for the house. You've seen the condition of that guest wing. I had. I had written a 22-page structural assessment of that guest wing, with photos and elevation drawings and a material recommendations appendix. On my own time, I told him I did know the condition of the guest wing. He said, so what is this? You're upset about what Dad said. I told him I wasn't upset. He was quiet for a long moment. Then his voice shifted down a register, into the tone he uses when he's decided to be reasonable. Look, he said, I know it probably seemed abrupt, the way Dad put it. He doesn't always pick the right moment. But the house has always kind of been the plan, you know? You're the one with the career, the income. You don't need a lake house. I've got Sasha and Maddie, and they need a place to settle. It makes more sense. I thought about that sentence. You're the one with the career, the income. The sentence that rewarded me for being the reliable one by telling me the reliable one doesn't need anything in return. I told Owen I understood his position. He said, so you'll reopen the fund? I told him no. He called me selfish. He didn't yell, but the word landed with precision. Then he said the thing he said at Christmas dinners and birthday parties and every family gathering where he needed me to stop being an inconvenience. He said, you know how much this matters to Mom and Dad. I told him I did know that. Then I told him I'd be in touch, and I ended the call. My father called the next morning. It was early before 7, which told me Owen had called him before he went to sleep. My father's voice had the patience of a man who has decided this is a misunderstanding and he is going to resolve it. Cal, he said, I think there's been some confusion. I said, I didn't think so. He said, whatever you thought you heard at dinner, the house situation is complicated. Your mother and I have been thinking about it for years. It's not something that was just decided. I noted that. Not something just decided. Meaning it had been decided for a long time. Just not shared with me. I said, Dad, I want to ask you something directly. He said, of course. I said, did you know the house was going to Owen when you asked me to co-sign the renovation fund? There was a pause. He said, the two things aren't related. But did you know? Another pause. Longer. He said, Your brother needs stability, Cal. You've built your life. You're self-sufficient. You don't need what he needs. That was not an answer to my question. It was a reason for his decision. And it was the same reason Owen had given me the night before, as if they'd rehearsed it, or as if they'd been saying it to each other for so long it had become the only sentence they knew. I asked him to think about whether he would like to talk more over the next few weeks. I told him I wasn't disappearing. I told him I would be available. He said he hoped I'd come to my senses and reopen the fund. I told him I'd be in touch. I want to tell you that the next 3 weeks were easy. They weren't. I'm not going to give you a version of this story where the hurt didn't exist. There were nights in my workshop when the math was very clear and the feeling underneath the math was not. I knew the numbers. I knew what I'd put in and what I was owed and what the property was worth. But knowing a thing and making peace with it are two different jobs, and I was working both at the same time. My friend Renata, who has known me since graduate school and who has an extremely low tolerance for self-pity, came over on the third weekend and sat in my kitchen and listened to the whole story. She's a real estate attorney in Detroit. She didn't say anything for a long time after I finished. Then she said, "Tell me about the renovation fund." "The exact mechanics," I told her. She was quiet for another moment. Then she set her coffee cup down and said, "Cal, you're the managing signatory on a $620 Zoo-zone loan secured against a property that was being renovated for someone else's inheritance. On a property you have documented maintenance history on going back 11 years. I said yes. She said, "You understand what that creates?" I said I was starting to. She said, "You should talk to someone who does estate and property law this week. Not because you're going to blow everything up. Because you deserve to know what you're holding before you decide what to do with it." I called Mitchell Crane the following Monday. He was a property attorney recommended by a colleague at my firm, a quiet man with an office above a bookstore in Ann Arbor, and a way of taking notes that looked like he was drawing something only he could understand. I brought him the folder, the whole thing. 247 line items, the foundation assessment, the renovation fund authorization documents, and the recorded deed on the lake house that I had pulled from the Leelanau County Register's office online. He read for 20 minutes without asking me a single question. Then he took off his glasses and set them on top of the folder. He said, "Mr. Dre, let me explain to you what's actually here." He told me 3 things in sequence, and each one changed the shape of the room. First, the renovation fund. Because I was the managing signatory on a loan secured against the property, I had a recorded financial interest in the Lake Leelanau property. The lender had required a co-signatory with demonstrated financial standing, specifically because my parents could not qualify a loan. That co-signature created a documented, recorded financial relationship between me and the asset. Closing the fund had removed the liability, but the recorded financial interest in the property didn't simply vanish because the project was halted. It required formal resolution. Second, the 11 years of maintenance. Michigan recognizes a legal doctrine called unjust enrichment, which is not complicated in plain language. If one person enriches another person's property through consistent expenditure over time, and there was a reasonable expectation of benefit, the person who paid can make a claim for the value of that benefit. $138,400 in documented expenditures with receipts on a property that increased in value partly because of those expenditures was not nothing. Third, and this was the one that made me sit back in my chair. He had pulled the renovation bids I brought him as part of the file. He asked me if I knew what a licensed contractor's signature on a renovation estimate constituted when that estimate was for a property on which I had a recorded financial interest. He said it meant that a significant portion of the planned renovation work was work that would have directly increased the value of an asset in which I had a documented stake. My signature had enabled the work. My credit had secured the fund. And the property, as currently titled, was the collateral. He said he'd want a week to review everything carefully. He said, "But from what I can see, the picture your family has of this situation is significantly different from the legal reality of this situation." I drove home from that office and made myself a very ordinary dinner. I did not call anyone. I did not text anyone. I cleaned up the dishes and went to my workshop and spent an hour doing something I do when I need my hands to be busy and my mind to be quiet. I was refinishing a section of oak trim for my own house, slow, careful work with a hand plane, removing just enough material to get the surface true. My family thought they had offended me at Christmas dinner. They thought I was sulking. They thought this was the kind of thing that would resolve itself in a few weeks, when I calmed down and remembered that family is family and Owen needs the house more than I do. They did not know I had 11 years of receipts and a property attorney in Ann Arbor. They did not know those were the same thing. My father tried a different approach in early January. He called on a Tuesday and his voice was different from the previous calls. Warmer. He asked about the Washtenaw County Bridge project. He asked how my workshop was coming. He told me about a conversation he'd had with a neighbor at the lake. He did all of this for about 5 minutes before he got to it. He said Owen's really worried about the Hendricks situation. The contractor has another project he could take if we don't give him a decision. I said I understood, he said. I want to be straight with you, Cal. I know the way I put it at Christmas wasn't ideal. Your mother and I should have talked to you separately before we said anything. That was a mistake in terms of timing. I noticed he said timing, not substance, not the decision itself. The timing. I told him I appreciated that. He said, but the house being Owen's is what makes sense for the family. You understand that, right? You've got your career, your house in Ypsilanti. Owen has Maddie. He has a family to settle. There it was again. The same logic, third time now, as if repetition would eventually make it feel like fairness. I asked him, Dad, do you know that my name is on the renovation loan as managing signatory? He said, of course, that's why he'd asked me to sign it. I asked him, did you understand that that creates a recorded financial interest in the property on my part? Silence. I said, not as a threat. I'm just making sure we're all talking about the same set of facts. He said, Cal, this is a family matter. We're not going to bring attorneys into this. I told him I already had. The silence on that call was a specific kind of silence I recognized. It was the silence of a man who has assumed the structure of a situation is one thing and just heard information suggesting it might be another. It was the silence of recalculation. He said, what does that mean? I told him it meant I had done what any engineer does when there's a load-bearing question. I got a professional opinion. I told him I wasn't going to do anything dramatic. I told him I wanted to find a resolution that was fair. But I needed him to understand that fair was going to have to look like something we all actually sat down and defined with the real numbers in front of us. He said he needed to talk to my mother. I told him to take his time. My mother's move came 2 days later, and it came from a direction I should have anticipated and didn't. She called my cousin Renee first. Renee is 4 years older than me, and we have always been close. The kind of close that comes from being the two people at family gatherings who would rather talk about anything other than what everyone is pretending is fine. My mother told Renee that I was threatening to take the lake house away from Owen's family, that I was using legal tactics against my own parents because I was angry about the inheritance, that I had always been difficult and ambitious, and this was the real me finally showing up. Renee called me the same afternoon. She said, I'm calling because your mother called me, and before I say anything, I want to hear your side. I told her the whole thing. 11 years. The foundation, the boiler, the dock, the Christmas dinner, the renovation fund, Mitchell Crane. Renee was quiet for a moment. Then she said something I wrote down because I wanted to keep it. She said, you didn't start this fight, Cal. You just stopped pretending there wasn't one. She said she was going to call your mother back and tell her she thought the family needed to sit down, together and talk. I told her that would be the right thing. My Uncle Dale, my father's younger brother, called me the following week. Dale is 61 and retired and has always been the most practical person in our extended family. He was at Christmas. He had been at the table. He said he'd watched the whole thing and hadn't said a word at the time because he didn't know the full picture, but he'd been thinking about it since. He said, your father has always treated you like the capable one, Cal. He just never figured out that the capable one was also the one owed something for being capable. Then he said, what are you actually asking for? What does a resolution look like to you? That question mattered. Because I had spent 3 weeks knowing what I was not willing to accept, and I had not yet named, precisely and out loud, what I was. I told Dale I didn't want to fight over the house. I didn't want to extract Owen from something he'd built his life around. Because whatever my parents had told him, he had built expectations on it. I didn't want my parents to sell the property at 70 to settle a legal claim. But I also was not going to co-sign any future renovation work on a property with no legal acknowledgement of what I had already put in. I was not going to watch $620,000 of my credit go toward an asset that had been spoken for without anyone telling me. And I was not going to sit across from my father and listen to the same sentence about Owen's family needing roots, as though it explained away 11 years. Dale said, so what would make it right? I told him 3 things. The property would need to be formally appraised. Whatever had been contributed to that value over the last 11 years in documented maintenance and improvements would need to be acknowledged in writing either as a formal debt from the estate or as an equity interest. The renovation fund would remain closed until there was a written agreement about how the property would be disposed of and what my financial interest in it was. and whatever agreement was reached, it would be reviewed by Mitchell Crane before I signed it. Dale said, "That's reasonable." He said he'd talk to my father. The family meeting was held on the last Saturday of January at the lake house itself, my father's idea. He said it was neutral ground. I thought, neutral ground that you have just told me belongs to Owen. But I let it go because the setting wasn't the point. Owen drove up with Sasha. I drove up alone. My parents were already there when I arrived. My mother in the kitchen, my father by the fireplace in the main room. And sitting across from him in a way that told me he'd been there a while, my Uncle Dale. Mitchell Crane was not in the room. He was in Ann Arbor with a copy of everything I had given him and his phone on. I had told him I would call if I needed him. We sat at the dining table. The lake outside was frozen flat and gray, the surface the color of old pewter, and the light came through the windows in the slow horizontal way it does in January in northern Michigan when the sun is barely clearing the tree line. My father opened. He said he wanted to start by saying that he and my mother were grateful for everything I had done for the property over the years. He said he meant that sincerely. He said no one was disputing that I had contributed. He used the word contributed. I noted it but said nothing. Then he said, "Your mother and I made a decision about the house. We're not changing that decision, but we want to find a way to honor what you've put in." He slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a handwritten number, $50,000. He said that was what they thought a fair acknowledgement of my contributions would be, paid out of the estate when the property eventually transferred. Owen looked at the number and then looked at the table. Sasha looked at Owen. Dale looked at his hands. I looked at the paper for a long moment. $50,000 against $138. $400 in documented expenditures on the property, not counting 11 years of professional assessment work performed at zero charge, against a renovation fund authorization that I had been carrying on my personal credit for 4 months. I said, "I'd like to walk through the actual numbers." I opened my folder. I had brought one copy of the 247-line expense record. I placed it on the table in the center where everyone could reach it. Owen said, "What is that?" I told him it was 11 years of maintenance records for the lake house. I told him I had kept them because I keep records for everything. I told him I wasn't presenting them as an accusation. I was presenting them because my father had said he wanted to honor what I'd put in, and honor should be based on what was actually there. I walked through it section by section, not every line, the summaries. The dock in 2012, the boiler in 2015, the foundation repair in 2019, 14 other items, smaller amounts, spread across the years, plumbing, the retaining wall on the north slope, the permit filings, the professional assessments I had done at no charge, which I had conservatively valued at my firm's current billing rate for a structural report of that scope. When I reached the total, I said the number out loud, $138,400, plus the renovation fund authorization I had been carrying for 4 months, which had temporarily encumbered my credit capacity and which would take 60 days to fully release from my credit profile. My mother's hand, which had been resting flat on the table, curled slightly at the fingers. Owen said, "Some of those are expenses that any family would share." I asked him which ones. He named 2. "Small amounts, a few $100s each," I said. "Of the rest?" He didn't answer. My father looked at the folder. He looked at it the way he had not looked at anything in this conversation, with actual attention. The attention of a man who is calculating and finding that the calculation is not arriving at the place he expected. He said, "Cal, you didn't tell us you were keeping track of all this." I told him I hadn't been keeping track. I'd just been keeping records. Those were different things. He said it was never our intention for you to feel like you were owed something. I told him I understood that. Then I said, "But the question of what I'm owed doesn't change based on what you intended, Dad. It changes based on what actually happened." Sasha, who had not spoken since she arrived, set her coffee cup down on the table with a small, deliberate movement. She looked at Owen. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Owen's jaw moved once. He was a man doing the math he had avoided doing for years, and the math was not kind to him. My father tried the approach he had used on the phone. He said, "We can talk about the number. The 50,000 was a starting point." I said, "Mitchell Crane has reviewed the file. He's available by phone if anyone has questions about the legal position." The name landed differently than I expected. My father's expression shifted, not into anger, into something more like the look he had in the kitchen on Christmas morning when the contractor called Owen's phone, except he was older now and the expression had more weight in it. He said, "You went to a lawyer." I said, "I got a professional opinion. That's what I do when there's a load-bearing question." A long quiet settled over that table. The lake outside the window was still and flat. The fire in the main room had burned down to coals. Nobody reached for a coffee cup. Then Owen spoke, and he did something I had not expected from him. He said, "Cal, what do you actually want?" Not defensive, not aggressive. Just the question, in the flat voice of someone who has decided to stop pretending. I looked at my brother, 34 years old, father of a 7-year-old in a paper crown. A man who had been handed a story about what he deserved and had never once thought to question whether the story was the whole picture. I told him the same 3 things I had told Dale: a formal appraisal, a written acknowledgement of my documented financial contribution, either as a debt from the estate or a defined equity interest, a written agreement about the property's disposition that my attorney would review. Owen said, "And if we do those things, you're not trying to take the house." I told him I was trying to make sure the house was built on something solid, which, I said, was the only thing I had ever done with it. That got a sound from Dale, something small that was not quite a laugh. My father looked at the table for a long time. He looked at the folder. He looked at the window. Then he said the thing I had driven 4 hours to hear, not because I needed the satisfaction of it, but because I needed the truth of it to be in the room with all of us at once. He said, "I should have talked to you before Christmas." He didn't say more than that. He didn't explain it. He didn't attach a condition to it. He just said it in the tone of a man who has finally said the true thing and is not sure what comes after. My mother pressed her fingertips together in her lap. She said, "We both should have." Owen looked at Sasha. She gave him the small, almost invisible nod of a woman who has been thinking clearly about this for longer than her husband has. Owen said, "Okay." Mitchell Crane drew up the agreement over the following 3 weeks. The property was appraised formally by a licensed assessor, a woman named Dr. Patrice Nolan from a firm in Traverse City who produced a 40-page report confirming the current market value and noting, specifically, the above-average condition of the foundation and structural systems. She asked who had been maintaining the property. I told her I had. She said it showed. The agreement Mitchell drafted recognized my documented contribution of $138,400 as a formal debt of the estate to be paid to me from proceeds before any distribution at time of sale or transfer. It acknowledged my recorded financial interest from the Renovation Fund authorization and formally released me from that instrument with a clean exit. It confirmed that the property would go to Owen on terms all parties had reviewed and signed, and that no future encumbrance on the property could be made without my written release of the financial interest on record. Owen signed it. My parents signed it. I signed it. Mitchell made 4 copies, one for each party, one for the Leelanau County Recorder's Office. I kept mine in a folder in my filing cabinet, behind the 11 years of maintenance records that had made it possible. That's where the formal part of the story ends. But there's a part after it that I want to tell you, because the part after it is the part I think about most. Owen called me in March, not about the house. He called to ask if I would look at a structural issue he'd noticed in the crawl space of his own house in Traverse City, the one he and Sasha had been renting for 2 years. He said the floor had developed a soft spot near the hallway bathroom and he wanted a professional opinion before he called a contractor. I drove up on a Saturday morning. I spent 2 hours under that house with a flashlight and a moisture meter, and the same methodical attention I give any structure I'm asked to assess. What I found was a failed vapor barrier and a joist that had taken on moisture over several winters, correctable, not catastrophic. I wrote him a 1-page summary with a recommended repair scope and 2 contractor names I trusted in that area. He read the summary, sitting at his kitchen table. Then he looked up and said, "You didn't have to drive up for this." I told him it wasn't far. He said, "I mean, you didn't have to. After everything." I thought about how to answer that. Then I said, "I know how to do this. If I know how to help and I don't, that's a choice. I'd rather make a different one." He nodded. He didn't say anything else about it. Maddie came in from the yard while we were still sitting there. She had mud on both knees and an expression of total confidence in her own decisions. She climbed up onto the chair next to me and showed me a rock she had found that she believed was special. I agreed with her assessment. It was a good rock. That mostly is where things stand. The lake house is Owen's to inherit. That hasn't changed, and I have no interest in changing it. What changed is that the number beneath it is honest now. The foundation is documented. The history is in writing. When my parents are gone, and the property transfers and the proceeds are calculated, my name will be in the column it belongs in, not as a grievance, as a fact. I still go up to the lake house, not as often, but when I do, I check the things I built: the dock, the foundation wall in the guest wing, the retaining wall on the north slope. I check them the way I check any structure I've worked on, not to prove anything, just to confirm that the work was done right and that it's holding. Last September, I was up there on an afternoon in early fall, the kind of afternoon where the lake is so flat it looks painted. I walked the dock to the end and stood there for a while. The planks I had replaced 13 years ago had held. The joints were clean. The post footings were solid. The work was holding. That's the whole thing, really. The work I did on that property was real. The money I put in was real. The 11 years were real. And for a long time, I had let the people around me treat real things as if they were just kindness, just family, just what you do. As if real things don't have weight and cost and value. They do. And you are allowed at any age, in any family, to put that weight on the table and say, this is what's actually here. Let's build on something solid. That's my story. 11 years, $138,400, and one canceled fund that finally made the numbers visible to everyone who had been comfortable not looking. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.